Good evening, everyone. May I please request everyone to be seated? We'll start shortly. Distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, and valued participants, my name is Sukanya, and I am part of Global India AI Summit team at Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. It's my honor to welcome you for the session on India AI, ensuring trust, safety, and governance in the AI age. Holistic governance of AI is an imperative of our time, a point of convergence where technology, policy, ethics, and social needs intersect. As AI rapidly evolves, governance has become essential for responsible growth and integration. Building on last year's GPI summit, where we explored in the evolving international governance landscape for AI, this year we are shifting our focus to domestic lens, recognizing the effective AI governance requires a nuanced understanding of both global and local context. India is taking this charge through Safe and Trusted AI initiative under IndiaAI mission, and India mission aiming to promote responsible AI practices and ensure fairness, transparency, and security. Most recently, MeitY also launched a call for expression on interest for organizations to explore and submit proposals on responsible AI themes for building tools and framework across different sectors. It touches upon different themes, including machine learning, synthetic data generation, algorithm, fairness tools, etc. And at the backdrop of all these developments, we are hoping that through today's session, we'll be able to highlight the components and objective of Safe and Trusted AI initiative, explore India's role and contribution in the international forum like G20 and GPI, focus on integrating ethics into the AI development in line with UN SDGs, and deliberate on balancing technological innovation with governance to protect citizen interest. So now I would like to call upon our esteemed panelists to join us on the stage for a quick photograph. Shri S. Krishnan, Secretary MeitY, Mr. Jibu Elias, Fellow and Country Lead for India at Responsible Computing Challenge Mozilla, Shri Mahavir Singhvi, Joint Secretary NEST, Ministry of External Affairs, Dr. Balaram Ravindran, Head, Center for Responsible AI at IIT Madras, Mr. Tim Curtis, Director of UNESCO Office in New Delhi, Mr. Sharad Sharma, Co-founder iSpirit, Shri Deepak Goyal, Scientist G and Group Coordinator, Cyber Laws Division MeitY. We also have Dr. Urvashi Aneja, Director, Digital Future Lab. She is joining us virtually. And Mr. Arjun Goswami, Director, Public Policy, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. He'll be joining us shortly. Thank you so much. So without any further delay, it's our great pleasure to now call upon our esteemed keynote speaker, Shri S. Krishnan, Secretary MeitY, to deliver his keynote address and share his valuable insight on the future of AI governance in India. So please.
Moderator of this session, Mr. Jibu Elias. Panelists, Dr. Urvashi Aneja, who's joining us virtually. Dr. Balraman Ravindran, Professor at IIT Madras, Arjun Goswami, who is expected to join us shortly, Shri Mahavir Singhvi, Joint Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, Mr. Tim Curtis, Director and UNESCO Representative here in South Asia, Mr. Sharad Sharma, Co-founder of iSpirit, and Shri Deepak Goyal, my colleague in the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. I think the key issue, at least as far as AI is concerned, is the whole concern that the world has in terms of what the technology holds for all of us. All of us tend to look at technology with a great deal of suspicion when it first emerges. Most of us believe that it could virtually be the end of the world. We've had several moments in history, in industrial history definitely, where we have been very fearful of what impact technology will have, how it will change our lives, and what it may do to all of us. There was a time during the first industrial revolution for people who opposed new technology coming in. They were called Luddites. and they were people who tried to prevent technology from coming in. Equally, there have always been enthusiasts for new technology, people who have been willing to go forth where others have not been willing to, and that is what has led to a lot of technological change, and that is what has led to a lot of development and progress in human history. Those of you who are familiar with the film Oppenheimer, you're reminded again about what can happen with new technology coming in, particularly with what can happen if, in that case, nuclear fusion is unleashed and what impact it could have. And equally, there are people there who argue for another technology which might be even better than the technology that they were dealing with, which is fusion instead of fission. So, and that's an argument which still goes on in that particular area or space. But in the end, we eventually adopted that technology. In the end, the guardrails or guidelines for using that technology also got established. There were international treaties, international conventions. There were ways in which the ill effects of that technology could be contained and prevented. It's not as if the risks have completely gone away. There is eternal vigilance, even in the nuclear disarmament space, which we continue to do. So there are lessons for us in terms of how technology can be used and not unleashed. The same thing happens with AI. The fears are multifold. There's one fear, of course, which is the most extreme one, of what happens if the level of intelligence that machines have exceeds that of humans, and where would we end up with that? We have thinkers on that space in this panel who'd be possibly answering those questions far better than I can. Equally, there are fears as to what it would do to the way we work today, the kind of fears that we had vis-a-vis the Industrial Revolution. Productivity goes up to such an extent that many jobs will go away. And what happens when jobs go away and people start losing their jobs and productivity goes up, and the kind of work that one person or about 15, 20 people were doing, and only one person is required to do that, then how do you find enough jobs for the rest? That is another fear which is fairly widespread. Clearly, it's a much more widespread fear in the Western world than it is in our side of the world. For the simple reason that the kind of jobs that are predominantly there in the services sector are the kind of jobs which could get automated and better done by machines. Traditionally, jobs which you imagine require a human mind could just get converted into jobs which could be done by machines. Typically a job like mine, right? I mean, which basically involves taking decisions on a range of inputs. It might be that, large offices could get replaced with much smaller teams which can quickly process whatever information is required and then move forward. And you might need far fewer people to run the offices than you need today. Clearly, white-collar employment of that range is much greater in the advanced world and in the Western world than it is in a country like India. So that risk in a country like India, you don't feel it as much as you do elsewhere, or particularly where the fears about job losses are far more exaggerated. On the opposite to that, thanks to the educational institutions that we have, thanks to the understanding of the number of STEM-related graduates that we have, there is a hope and an expectation, and more than a hope and an expectation, a potential that a lot of the background AI work which needs to be done, a lot of the adaptation that needs to be done, a lot of the application building that needs to be done could end up being done in countries like India far more economically than it would be done elsewhere in the world, and that possibly represents an opportunity for India's youth And that sort of replaces some proportion of even Indian jobs with higher paying and better jobs than they are today. So for a country like India, there could be a trade-off in this entire space. But for many other parts of the world, there may be a genuine fear that the kind of job losses which can happen could be very different. And the last fear, which is fundamentally about the kind of harms that AI could cause, both societally and personally. Clearly, impersonation, misinformation, disinformation is something that we would have to live with. Invasion of our privacy is something that we may have to live with or we may have to counter. And those are very real fears. And those fears are much more real in democracies than they are in other, other countries. And that is something that we have to necessarily take note of and necessarily work towards ensuring that we don't descend there or it doesn't happen. And that's where, guardrails, regulation of some form, declarations of various kinds become important. Because quite honestly, when you have a lot of misinformation or fake information, the crucial thing that you need is to have a mechanism by which you're able to actually identify what is the right information and a mechanism by which you can get to the right information as quickly as possible. Sometimes, of course, time becomes extremely important. Issues can be very emotive, and the damage that very authentic looking, authentic seeming fake information can do is huge, and which warrants a lot of vigilance and action to sort of counter it much faster than you would in other cases. What we call virality, thanks to social media and internet and everything else being so ubiquitous today, virality is a problem that we have to deal with in the sense of one issue getting magnified and becoming huge before you're able to attend to it and see that the impact of it is countered or impact of it is contained. And that is something which I think as people in government, it concerns us a huge deal. And misinformation, disinformation could also end up in terms of democratic rights of people affecting choices in a way that you do not want them to be affected. Ultimately, democracy is about choice, and democracy is about giving people the chance to make the right decisions, being given the right information. If they get wrong information and they make a choice based on wrong information, there is a serious concern to democratic societies, and I think that is something that all of us realize. Across the world it is realized, particularly in a year like 2024, where there are elections from January 24 till November 24, there are going to be elections all over the world in all the major democracies. And those concerns, we have seen them play out, not to the extent that we feared, but definitely is a reality and is something which needs to be addressed. Equally, there are issues of privacy at an individual level. Your individual rights of privacy could be affected. There could be rights which relate to copyrights which could be affected. Your creativity with which you create, and there are many creators, and this is after all also a world of creators. So how do you sort of address creativity issues? How do you address copyright issues? How do you address patent issues? Individual rights is something, again, which needs to be addressed at a personal level and which need to be protected at a personal level, given all the impact that it could have. And we are well aware that the way of approaching these concerns, the way of approaching what needs to be done to protect many of these aspects, is what is dominating global debate this year. We've had, this year the GPI is being held, a ministerial summit is being held a second time within the year. We've held a mid-year kind of consultation. In addition to this event here in India, UK and many other countries have held in Seoul, and many other countries we have held these events. there is a need that many countries across the world feel to consult, to speak to others on these issues, consult with various stakeholders on these issues to ensure that we come to some sort of a sensible decision, a sensible consensus, move forward in a direction that works for everybody. And this is very crucial because in this, we learn from each other. We also learn from mistakes that we make, that either any of us can make, and we also learn from the kind of concerns. We have to adapt it to the kind of concerns that each country has or each society has to address the kind of issues that they could run into. And that is where this consultative process, this multi-stakeholder approach becomes very, very important. And for us, and so different approaches are taken by different jurisdictions in the world. I'm sure the experts will talk about the kind of approach that the EU has taken, which is more regulation heavy, the kind of approach the United States has taken based on their executive orders that they have issued, and likewise the approach that China has taken, for instance, and many other jurisdictions in the world have taken. We can sort of examine them, approach them from every dimension, the kind of concerns that they are trying to address in this entire process. In India's case, this is one area which I think, as a matter of policy, we have attempted to be a little more deliberate in approaching. It is our belief that we need to understand the way in which different countries have approached this issue, figure out what has worked for them and what has not worked before we decide on what our approach itself to regulating AI needs to be. Some elements of that regulatory approach are already in place. Some elements are covered by existing law or by laws which are about to be implemented. One example, of course, being the DPDP Act. And once the rules come into play, and that is something which is expected in the coming months, then definitely we'll at least be able to look at some element of the way that data gets used for AI purposes. That is something that we can certainly address. Equally, we need to understand that existing laws in India cover things like misinformation and disinformation. That is something that there are powers with relevant agencies to address even as we speak. And if there are deep fakes, ultimately, it's only a matter of degree. Fakes of various kinds people do make even already and try to pass off as something which is genuine. It's only that with artificial intelligence, it's more difficult to detect what are fakes and what are not fakes. And that is it's in some senses a matter of degree or a matter of kind. And there would be a related issue in terms of establishing who's responsible for what has happened. Because there could be an interesting argument that this is artificially generated, and therefore there's no one whom you can hold accountable if there is a piece of disinformation that comes up. Probably that may not be the most appropriate line to take in certain cases. If an entity or an agency is offering that as a service, and they have built a foundational model, and it throws up something which amounts to disinformation, or it throws up material which could be misleading or which could be problematic, at least we need to know that this is synthetically created and this is not a natural image or a natural video or a natural voice. As long as you know that, and as long as you know that this content is not actually true or is not naturally true, then you can take whatever remedial measures that you need to. You can choose not to believe it, or you can just marvel at how accurate or how well done that particular representation is, as opposed to trying to believe it to be true and therefore problematic. So I think that becomes, labeling becomes, watermarking becomes a critical element of what needs to happen in this entire space. And equally, entities which put out these models need to take some responsibility for adequately testing them before they actually go out into the market. We do understand that these models learn with greater use, but at least if there is labeling and if there is a way that the material comes into, is first labeled as something which is synthetically generated, that in itself gives you great comfort that this is the manner in which it goes. And of course, there is the other element of bias or inherent bias, and the only solution for bias really is what in the India AI mission we are attempting to do in terms of developing our own foundational model and in terms of making sure that there is more data from, say, countries like India, which enable the bias to be countered, and that is something which our educational institutions, our IITs and others are also working on as we speak. So that becomes another element that needs to be countered within the model in terms of what happens there. But it also sets a responsibility for agencies which prepare all of these models, that while we are guinea pigs and you are testing all of these models on the general population, there's a degree of responsibility that they need to assume to actually make sure that they don't cause more harm. It's almost like a Hippocratic oath that they need to take, that before you do any good, please don't cause any harm. So that, I think, becomes an important element of what needs to happen. Having said all this, on the balance, I would still believe that, at least as far as a country like India is concerned, and even globally, artificial intelligence holds tremendous potential. It's not something which arrived, it's something we are taking notice of today, but it's been something which has been around for decades and has been spoken of for decades. Suddenly, the level of technological sophistication has gone up. Suddenly, we have enough compute power to run these large models. And as all of that becomes available, it comes more into public use and more into general use. And that is why, for society at large, it becomes a major concern. So it is then that government steps in and looks to see how the regulation should be. And in the Indian context, we really need to balance all the good that it can potentially do to our economy and all the work that it can do to us and all the positive impact that it can have for a country like India. We need to account for it before we sort of get into another dimension of trying to restrict all of it. So the regulation of it becomes very important, and the regulation of it is not only through legal tools or measures and requirements and guardrails that we build in. Some of it, in terms of the control, actually is from the technology itself. And often I'm reminded in this context of, the Vishnu Sahasranamam, which talks about the 1008 names of Vishnu. Some of it is very interesting. They contradict each other. So there's a particular thing where he has two names. He's called Bhayakrit, and he's also called Bhayanashanaha, next to each other. Bhayakrit means one who creates fear, and Bhayanashanaha means the one who destroys that fear. So technology virtually functions in the same way. It creates the fear, and thereafter it has a potential of destroying it. And I think we need to rely on technology and applying technology and regulation intelligently to make sure that a techno-legal framework is built whereby we protect ourselves against whatever harm that AI can cause, while at the same time ensuring that we harness its full capability for doing good for society at large. Because as somebody was once reminding me, that the potential of growth that artificial intelligence can create in this century is almost the same growth that it created in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution, the first mechanical industrial revolution created in the 18th century. So that is the kind of potential which exists, and that is a potential we simply can't afford to lose. Thank you very much. I'm sure you'll have a very enriching discussion with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your enlightening and thought-provoking address. We are happy to inform you that we are also joined by Mr. Arjun Goswami, and we'll request him to please join other panelists on stage. Thank you, sir. We'll now hand over the session to our distinguished moderator, Mr. Jibu Elias. He will guide us through this through stimulating discussion and Q&A session, delving deeper into the intricacies of domestic AI governance. Over to you, sir.
Uh, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session on India AI, ensuring safety, trust, governance in the age of AI. Today, we gather at a crucial juncture where the convergence of technology, policy, ethics, and societal needs demands our collective attention and action. As Secretary Sir spoke before, the rapid advancement in AI holds immense potential to transform various sectors, but they also pose significant challenges that require robust governance frameworks to ensure safety, trust, and ethical deployment. India, through its initiative like the Safe and Trusted AI pillar under IndiaAI mission, is leading the way in creating comprehensive governance structures. These efforts aim to balance technological innovation with safeguards that protect citizen interest, emphasizing fairness, transparency, and security. India's leadership in global forums such as UN, G20, the Global Partnership on AI, further underscores this commitment to responsible AI practices. So this session will delve into four key objectives. One will be highlighting the Safe and Trusted AI initiative, India's role in various international AI forums, and integrating ethics into AI development, and finally how balancing innovation and governance works. So our distinguished panel includes experts who has been at the forefront of governance of AI and ethical AI development. So I hope they will bring a wealth of knowledge and experience that will enrich our discussions and provide valuable insights into the path forward. So I will start off with questions, and each of you have around 3 minutes to answer these questions. Following that, if time permits, we can open up the floor for questions from the audience as well. So my first question is to you, sir, Mahavir Singhvi. Sir, India's national AI strategy advocates for something we are all very proud of, which is AI for all. So how can AI development in this light of AI for all be made more inclusive and ensure that equitable benefits reach all the sections of our society?
Thank you. Let me first thank Mighty for inviting me here. I'm very delighted to be present here today. This subject I've started dealing with only from last 1 year when I joined the Ministry of External Affairs, a new division which is called New Emerging and Strategic Technologies Division. So I won't say that I'm an expert on this, but I'll try to answer what you have said. But before that, something which Secretary Mighty has told about how the technology, can create benefits as well as create, kind of harm to the society. That is very, very telling in terms of he has drawn a parallel between the nuclear technology, which was built and can be used both for the civilian purpose as well as for the military purpose. The same goes with AI. And I think AI has a civilian dimension as well as, the military dimensions. Of course, the discussion today is primarily on the civilian dimensions of it. And in that context, I think it has profound potential for transforming societies. And that's already been pointed out. But I would say that you are talking about the India AI mission. The answer lies in that, your question itself. That the India AI mission has the 7 pillars in it. And each one of the pillar is geared towards making it more inclusive, ensuring equitable benefits that reach all the sections of the society, whether it's the compute, where it will be, based on the public-private partnership. The idea is to make it available to everyone to innovate on that. Similarly, the India Innovation Center, India AI Datasets Platform, AI application development initiatives, future skills, startup financing, safe and trusted AI, that's a pillar on which this session is built on. I think these all are the things which are perhaps very, very important to make sure that AI becomes more inclusive in terms of its benefits and ensure that the benefits reaches all the sections of the society. Similarly, I think that to make it even more robust, what we need to have is a multi-stakeholder dialogues like this particular conference. I think it's very important to get ideas, identifying priorities, leveraging open source technologies. All these priorities of all the sections of the society needs to be heard and taken into consideration while devising our policies and our, the legal framework, our governance frameworks. I think that's very, very important. And we cannot have a top-down approach in this. There has to be a multi-stakeholder approach in particularly in dealing with AI. So I think it's very, very important that we look at this issue from a multi-stakeholder dialogue perspective. Similarly, we also need to have a, we must we must identify the welfare-centric use cases in priority sectors such as health, for diagnosing diseases, for agriculture, for increasing productivity, education, for personalized learning, and so on. And I think these are again very important aspects if you want to take the benefits of AI to everyone and towards the last mile. I think these are important issues which we need to have, included in our discussions at every forum and every, kind of platform which is available to us. Similarly, we also need to leverage India data richness and linguistic diversity to build an inclusive and representative AI model. This is again, as Secretary Sir has talked, that we need to, eliminate the biases, particularly when we talk about building our own models. It's very important that we have our own data sets so that we do not face the kind of problems which we might encounter if we do not have that, in terms of building our own models. Similarly, also we need to leverage our strength in the open source technology as we have done, and we have seen in case of DPI how it has helped us. I think that's very important that we develop AI also similarly, considering open source models and publicly available data sets. That's again very important aspect of it. So I think we need to focus on all the pillars of the India AI mission itself to make it more inclusive and kind of beneficial to everyone in the society. So I think that is something very, very important. We need to look at the technology from the point of view of, kind of benefits it can generate in terms of making, potential of everyone's available to every kind of development initiative which we have in the society. It can really transform the societies in multiple ways, and that's what I think we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Singhi. So, sir, you have mentioned about the potential to transform AI, and I have a question to you, Secretary Sir, because your closing remark about Vishnu and the Bayakrid and Bayanasana, which is very apt, and as you pointed out, nuclear technology as well. Sir, how can we ensure that, like in a country like India, we have always harness the positive effect of nuclear energy, right? Nuclear power plants and all. So how we ensure that we will use AI for only Bayanasana and not Bayakrita?
No, I think that is inherent in the technology. The technology can cut both ways, so which is why it operates in a way that it creates the fear, and it's human effort and the way we come together and the governance structures that we create and the way we govern this and the intent with which we govern it and the way in which we take note of concerns of all the segments, all the stakeholders, and that's the way in which you sort of make sure that you use it in a way that benefits the people whom it's intended to benefit. I think that is crucial. It is human nature, or at a very fundamental level, the nature of a democracy, the consultative process, the multi-stakeholder approach, making sure that you get in the relevant expert opinions, making sure that you have the talent which can understand the potential and which has the voice to tell you that this is what is beneficial and this is what will work and this is the way you do it. So that's the way you evolve an approach, and I think that is something which the world in general and India as a country is quite capable of through the institutions that it has. but you need to build specific mechanisms for AI, just as you built mechanisms for other technologies. With the caveat that don't build mechanisms which are so restrictive that you don't get the kind of benefits that you're looking to get.
Thank you, sir. And speaking about building frameworks and institutions, sir, over to Ravi, sir, here. So the question is, in this case, when it comes to safety and trusted building AI initiatives, what do you think are the biggest concerns as from an ethical and trustworthy AI point of view that surrounds AI development and deployment in India?
Sure. So some of the concerns are universal, right? So you were asking me particularly about how we do this in India. So let me take that angle, right? So for example, when we talk about an AI being fair or ethical decision making, right? So one can argue that a loan manager in a bank is being unfair towards people who don't have money, but that's the unfairness that he is expected to have, because he wants to see a collateral before he can give a loan. So almost anywhere where you are making this kind of discriminative decisions, you're going to have some notion of fairness and unfairness, some notion of bias that's going to creep in. And what is acceptable to us are notions that align with our social standards, align with our ethical standards or legal standards, right? And what are these standards for India across various sectors? I'm not sure we have a good specification for it, right? So what is the notion of bias in language use, right? What is the notion of the different kinds of biases that are present in various Indian languages, right? You might talk about English, that's being well understood, but what about the different Indian languages? How do you even express bias? Do we have a characterization of it so that we can build AI systems that avoid that bias, right? So starting from that point, right? There are a lot of challenges, and how would you characterize fair and ethical system in the Indian context? And I don't think we are doing enough for that yet, right? So that is one part of it. The second part of it is to do with the trust piece, right? So we would trust something as long as it's transparent to us, right? So we kind of believe the process by which a decision has been arrived at, right? And for this, we need to really understand the decision-making process, right? So a lot of people talk about how AI systems are black boxes and we cannot understand them, right? But I don't think we quite understand how the neurons in our head operate, right? So it's not that I need to get down to the level of how the neural network or whatever is the black box really operates. All I need is a kind of a chain of reasoning that a human being or the lay user who is being subjected to those decisions can understand, right? Now, how would I build these kinds of chains of reasoning that's understandable to a person, right, in India, right? So now, as a country, so we have to accept that a large fraction of our population is not well educated and trained. So it's not like I can the level of explanations has to really go down to what somebody in the village can understand, and somebody who doesn't speak English or doesn't have a very sophisticated worldview can understand, right? So it becomes even more challenging when you're talking about diverse locations and diverse societal settings in which we look to deploy this AI, right? So how would you build solutions that are transparent and trustworthy across a wide range of population? It shouldn't be because somebody said so that I have to accept this, right? So that's the trust angle of it, right? And finally is, of course, the safety angle of it. So again, the big challenge with regard to safety is, the current level of AI technology is essentially generalizing from examples, really, right? You're talking about learning from large volumes of data, but this is essentially a lot of examples from which the AI system is learning. It's not really inducing more general principles, right? So it's always possible that the examples do not cover the universe. Right? It's not always, but it's almost always the case the examples do not cover the universe, right? So there are always going to be cases where things will fail. So I was having this discussion earlier with somebody. So if you take two different systems, both have like a 80% performance, but the 80% are not equal, right? So in one case, it might be the most obvious 80% that I get right. In another case, it could be that there are very, very critical conditions which could cause, a serious loss. Let's say in the healthcare case, it could lead to loss of life, and I get those correct, even though I might get some very simple 20% wrong, which, maybe another human just looking at it very quickly can tell me, right? So what is the, guarantees of safety that we can build to these systems, especially given the current state of AI technology? I mean, this is not unique to India, right? It's a problem that we're going to face everywhere in terms of deploying AI in critical technology. So going back to the Secretary Sir's example of nuclear technology, if you're using AI to control, fusion reactors, I'm more comfortable with that. But when you have AI actually making decisions that affect humans' life right away, I don't think we have a good characterization of what are the operating limits for that.
Thank you, Professor Ravi. I think you made a very important point about the decision-making aspect of AI. When AI comes into decision-making roles and the black box behind it. I think I will go to Urvashi Aneja, who is joining us online. Urvashi, are you there? I hope you are online.
Yes, Jibu.
Yes, Urvashi. So just following up on what Professor Ravi just said. So my question to you will be, how can India AI mission ensure that some of this accountability and transparency in AI decision-making process will be ensured? And what measures can we take to prevent biases in AI systems and algorithms, especially when it comes to a decision-making role, like let's say bank loan or any other personal-related matters?
Thanks, Jibu, for that question, and thank you to Meiti for inviting me for this conference. And I apologize for not being able to be there in person, but I hope I can connect with some of you at a later time. I'll try and answer that question in the few minutes I have. I think there's a lot to unpack there in the question that you've posed. On one hand, I think there's certain kind of process-related steps that are important to institutionalize if we want to advance transparency and accountability of AI systems. Some of these might include things like mandating data cards or model cards, which give information about the data that a model was trained on, the kind of parameters, the weights, similar to how we have nutrition labels for food. When we buy something in the supermarket, it tells us very clearly, do not eat this if you have allergies, or this was produced using XYZ products, so on and so forth. So you provide the public information, you provide end users information to allow them to make decisions about what product they want to use and how, and that's an important way to advancing transparency and accountability. When we're thinking specifically around AI systems for critical decision making, I think there we need to kind of tackle this explainability problem head on. We shouldn't pretend that it's something that we can address very simply in technical terms or otherwise. And so I think there we might want to think about avoiding using AI systems for critical decision making, and if we must use them for critical decision making, using simpler models where the logic of the decision can be explained more easily to the end user. So piggybacking on what Ravi was saying previously, it's not about every piece, the exact logic being comprehensible, just as we can't understand why we as individuals make certain decisions, but about the logic being communicatable to the end user, regardless of what their capacities might be. So that's something we might want to think about as well. I think a third point that is really important is adequate testing. And I think it's important that this testing and the results of that testing are made. The testing is done not in just a lab environment, but in a real world field environment across different social groups, across different social contexts. And the results of that testing also be made publicly available. I think equally, we also need to think about sector-specific certifications. We also need transparency around companies' governance, the governance structures of companies themselves, and how decisions are being made. So kind of zooming out from the data and the model layer to looking at the organizations. We also need transparency around data sharing. In India, if we are to realize the kind of AI for all vision, we do expect a large amount of data sharing between the public and private sector, and we need transparency around what kind of data is being shared. We need purpose limitation around what it can be used for, and so on and so forth. And I think it would be odd for me not to point out also that we definitely need better gender representation in teams that are building AI, teams that are evaluating AI systems, that are building policies around AI systems. So I think there's a number of such processes that one can institute that can advance transparency and accountability, whether it's at the data or the model layer or around kind of company governance or about the people who are building these tools. But I'd also like to suggest that we need more than such process-based interventions. We actually, I think, need now an outcomes-based approach. And I'll just spend a minute explaining what I mean by that. I think that the approach in India so far has been to establish a broad policy agenda around AI for good, and then support startups in realizing that agenda through access to data, access to capital, another infrastructure. And they're expected to kind of build a bunch of use cases, and these use cases are then supposed to catalyze change in critical social sectors. And then we also expect them to abide by some loose guidelines and guardrails, such as principles of responsible AI. But the difficulty with establishing meaningful transparency and accountability in such an approach is that on the one hand, many of these companies might be very new to the social sectors that they are working in. They may not have previously worked in agriculture or worked in healthcare. The choice of use case that they might develop might also be shaped by very practical considerations, like the sustainability of the revenue model or data availability or their geography of operation. And guardrails around specific technological processes are very hard to keep up with. So for an example, now we have large language models that render the explainability problem even more complicated. Or we now have advances in XR technology, which make it very difficult to separate between different kinds of data, such as sensitive data and non-sensitive data. And it puts a huge amount of onus on policymakers, on auditors, to be able to understand the inner mechanics of these use cases or the products that these companies are developing. And so what I think is we need a different approach altogether. So instead of this process-based approach, what we need is an outcome-based approach where we as a society define the outcomes that we desire from AI products and tools, not companies, not the market. And the task for companies is to innovate towards that vision. So that's a very different context what we have right now, where we expect a huge amount of use cases to actually add up to societal change or to contribute towards societal change in a kind of organic and peace manner. And I don't think that's necessarily the most strategic way to go about it, especially if we're thinking about accountability to a broader question of public interest. So just to give you an example, and I'll close with that. So in the case of healthcare, we have many incredibly talented startups working in the Indian ecosystem. But they are all developing use cases based on what they feel is important or what their capacities will permit. If we flip that around and instead we say that public and civic institutions need to identify the key changes needed to improve the quality of healthcare in a state. So this requires us to build a theory of change about the current problem, about the and about the expected solutions, and to do this in a consultative manner that engages with civil society, engages with affected communities, etc. And then the task for companies is to demonstrate the outcomes of their AI interventions on that theory of change. How do their use cases help advance that theory of change? And how can they then be held accountable towards a broader notion of public interest and actual societal change rather than kind of piecemeal approaches around specific use cases. So the essence of what I'm saying is that we as society, as public institutions, need to state the outcomes and let startups innovate and compete to deliver on those outcomes. We can impose additional constraints saying that these must be privacy protecting and the models must be explainable to the end user. And the task is then that's the task for innovation. How do you innovate within these constraints? And so I feel that kind of approach actually has the potential to drive innovation, drive accountability, and really center the core value of public interest beyond kind of relevant but also very difficult to operationalize principles like accountability and transparency. So I'll stop here and of course happy to come back to any of this.
Thank you, Urvashi. I think you made some very interesting points. One is the outcome-based approach we need. And speaking about guardrails, how will it keep up with the advancement in AI? So I think I want to come to Mr. Goyal with a question. Or now, how can, based on this guardrails approach, what are the strengths and weakness of our existing laws in regulating AI? And how does, as a government, we can adapt to the keep up with the pace in which the rapid development of AI technologies is happening?
I think I will just take on what Urvashi was saying, the outcome-based approach. This is very good thought. Whatever is happening through the outcomes, that should be accountable. The entities, they should be responsible. And moreover, the technology should not be punished. The entity who is who is basically causing the harm should be punished. The laws should be like that. The laws should be outcome-based. So, since morning, Minister Sir and Secretary Sir and so many other speakers, they have given us so many adjectives and nouns and actionable things to work upon. Just try to jot down a few. Ease of doing business, ease of use, fake news, deepfakes, disinformation, misinformation, all get simplified by the AI. Everything. The good thing also and the bad things also. Good things also always gets appreciated, bad things needs to be accounted for. So now the present IT Act, right now in the Indian context, the law enforces the Information Technology Act, its rules. So during this election process, the government has to deal with all those misinformations, disinformations, deepfake videos, and the ministry continuously issues advisories, and most of those intermediaries, they try to abide by those advisories also. And then ministry has issued some rules also where intermediaries are made accountable, and post accountability of their actions, there is a grievance officer in their respective domains. Ministry has established a grievance addressal committee also to address the concerns not addressed by the grievance officer of the respective intermediaries. In the IT rules, similarly, we have 43A SPDI rules, sensitive personal data information rules, which post Digital Personal Data Protection Act, whenever it gets enforced, are going to get repealed. I think, Zibu, I would stop here. I think that would be.
Thank you, Mr. Goyal. I think we've been discussing so far about AI and its safety and trust challenges from an Indian perspective. I think we want to widen the horizon a little more. So coming to Mr. Curtis here, sir, with UNESCO, can you give us a brief idea on how does UNESCO support research and innovation in AI while ensuring that it aligns with the ethical standards and governance frameworks we have discussed?
Thank you. Sorry, thank you for that. I think this has been a fascinating conversation for me, and I have many ideas I'd like to expand on. But just to let you know that we don't do directly research. We harness the research from around the world to try to foster agreements that countries in their different sizes and contexts and issues can agree on. So in that sense, in 2021, UNESCO developed the first really universal recommendation concerning, let's say, the social side, the ethics of artificial, 2021 recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is really a groundbreaking instrument, not so much because it's hardcore legally binding, but because it represents a discussion among all 194 countries on what are the sort of baseline ethical considerations for the development of artificial intelligence, and it covers 11 policy topics ranging from agriculture to culture to gender to a whole range, environment, because all of this artificial intelligence doesn't exist in the sky. It still has to be produced through energy, which produces carbon, and so on and so on. So there's this broad context. And the issues really can change. Now I'm going to speak not as an expert on AI, because I'm not one, but as somebody who has quite a lot of experience in the area of social and human sciences, and particularly culture. What I see, looking at this, is, and I think it's been said, is really the issue is not the technology. The issue is us as human beings, and this technology will amplify our social, political, cultural relations. And that's the real issue. what do we want to do? And I think that's the outcome-based issue. That what do we want to do with this, and what does the global community want to do with it? So I won't go into the details of what this recommendation entails. You can find it. I would encourage you to have a look at it. It has a series of recommendations, which are the result of long deliberations and meetings from experts, researchers from all corners of the world, and which has now resulted in a practical sense to what we call the readiness assessment methodology, which we are now carrying out in around 50 to 60 countries, which is essentially a list of some 300 questions to help governments, policymakers, stakeholders check how they are in their particular context in the implementation of that. So we had recently a meeting with METI, a wonderful meeting with 100 participants from across India, and we plan to launch this and publish this in India next year. We're doing it in about 50, 60 countries this year around the world. We'll be continuing to do it. And I think this is really important to have this discussion also at this global level, so that there are these common standards, be they just as we have in human rights and other areas, on how this can best be leveraged to benefit everyone. Again, we know, if I may say so, the Sustainable Development Goals are not on track. AI gives us a huge potential opportunity to fast-track some of those issues, and that's, again, outcome-based. And if we can leverage it in that direction, fantastic. That would be wonderful. So we are working with that, and we've done some research recently. Just put out a report on artificial intelligence and democracy, looking, as the Secretary said earlier, on the impacts on democratic systems around the world and other issues. But I will just say at this stage, what happens in India is important for the world. India is at a critical position. And what goes on here will have impact not just in India, but around the world, because of the population, because of the economic growth, because of the strong innovation sector in India. So these discussions are very exciting, and I think to continue these discussions within the country, but also with the neighbors, with all countries, and to make sure that the discussions are happening globally, with those you might think are going to be the least impacted, the smaller countries, the ones that don't have the infrastructure, they will be impacted, and their issues will also reverberate around the world. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. I think one key point I resonate a lot is you mentioned the need to have a global discussion, as well as how much the world is looking at India to make a mark here. So I will go to the end of the line, Mr. Arjun Goswami. So, sir, I want to ask you a question based on where India stands from a global perspective, right? What challenges has India may encounter aligning with AI, international AI regulations, especially with its domestic laws, and how can we address these things, as well as what are the measures we can take as a country in advancements while remaining competitive in adhering to these global standards that Mr. Curtis has mentioned?
Well, thank you very much. As you know, I was late today, and I was hoping that if AI had advanced sufficiently, there'd be a younger, better version of me just sitting here virtually, and I wouldn't be required at all. So hope springs eternal. The question is interesting because at one level, when we think about the global conversations that are going on, India held the G20 presidency last year, and there were statements about leveraging AI for public good, ensuring that AI development deployment would be safe, and all of that. India has signed the Bletchley Declaration on AI use, safety and trust, but these are not binding declarations. So that's not just some lawyer trying to be clever about this, but it means that things aren't set. That said, I think
our Prime Minister went out and indicated, he made one statement that I thought was hugely important. I mean, it really struck a big chord with me. He said, we have to make sure that the information that's generated by AI is credible. Now, for that to happen, we need to participate through our domestic laws and regulations so that we don't end up simply being a rule taker. I think we need to exercise our responsibilities in terms of being a rule setter. That's not an easy thing to do, where the path is not clearly lit. I mean, this pathway on AI regulation, people talk about the things that are happening in other parts of the world domestically, but these are very nascent, right? These are very new regulations. Even the EU, which people talk about a lot, I mean, that act only came through in 2024, and it's not effective in full measure until 2027. That's where we are. So I think there's a lot to play for. Now, if we want to protect our sort of innovation drive in the face of all this, which I think was the other part of your question, the kind of light touch that we're thinking about, understanding the nature of the partnership that we want to have with industry, which is what many of these consultations are about, are a great opportunity. And I think these missions which are now being launched are ways of doing that. And industry also needs to give back in terms of industry standard setting, etc. So, my thought would be that these are ways in which we can collectively address the challenge. We're not in a cage where international agreements have bound us hand and foot. It's all to play for, and we're right in the front row of, if I can use a footballing analogy, strikers, right?
Thank you, sir. That's a very good analogy. You mentioned about importance of partnership with industry, and I think nobody here better than Mr. Sharad Sharma to speak about that here. So, Mr. Sharad Sharma, my question is, when building on India's presence as in a global scenario, how does India can balance its goal of technological sovereignty with its commitment to the international forums like GPay and G20? How can we do that?
Thank you. Look, we are in our third phase of dealing with this question. So first is, digital sovereignty is a great phrase to use outside India, but in India we've been using colonization, because our worry is, will we get colonized again, right? And so that led us to think about the only way to prevent colonization is to have strategic autonomy in a particular sector. Now, this is not a new idea. I mean, in the first wave of getting strategic autonomy in space or in nuclear, since that came up, atomic energy, this was government-driven initiative, 100% government-driven. In 2012, when the digital colonization became an issue, India innovated and said, hey, we can't have it completely government-driven. Government has a role to play, and that role is that of DPI. And I think now looking back from India Stack, conceived in 2012 to where we are today, that is a concept that has taken root. But it has also revealed to us the limitations of the DPI model. And AI, for example, is not amenable to, we cannot get strategic autonomy in AI by just using the DPI model. So we've had to go back to the drawing board to think about what would be our way. And 2.5 years ago, that effort was called the playground model, and that has been applied to defense products and telecom equipment. And I would say, while defense is a story that is still unfolding, in telecom equipment, we have had considerable success, right? And so I think AI belongs to this third approach that we have to take, right? Now, what are the elements of this approach? The elements of this approach are three. The first is that we have to leverage our domestic market. That necessarily means that we have to do nuanced ring fencing. Now, can we do nuanced ring fencing for telecom? Can we do that for defense? Can we do that for semiconductors? Can we do that for AI? What does it mean in all of these areas is a question that we have to answer. Second, and Professor is sitting next to me, and we've had these conversations before, we have to focus on R&D, especially pre-commercial industry-directed R&D. We are the only big economy in the world which for 2 consecutive decades has had a falling percentage of private sector R&D. So why is that the case? Do we understand why is it that our private sector is not engaging in pre-commercial industry-directed R&D? And answer, if we can diagnose the problem, we can answer it. Because without dealing with R&D, we cannot get strategic autonomy in AI, right? And the third, of course, is regulation, which probably we'll come back to a little later. We have to have highly progressive regulation. And Professor Ravindran chaired a subcommittee on this. The report is not yet out, but I'm hoping that it will be out in the future. Part of the motivation there was to create a playground that would allow India to have strategic autonomy in AI. I agree with many people here that if we don't have strategic autonomy in AI, all the good work that we have done with India Stack is actually goes to zero, because it is inevitable we will be a digital colony. And to Secretary Krishnan's view, our democracy will be at threat. This is not just us worrying about it. This is the European countries worrying about democracy at threat because what they would call as not having enough autonomy or strategic autonomy in the area of AI. So I think we have a huge challenge, a challenge that we have never ever faced before. It is a challenge bigger than nuclear. It is a challenge bigger than telecom. In many ways, and time will tell whether we can apply the playground approach to AI, and we have a lot of work ahead of us to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. I think one thing I want to also bring up is from a global perspective, you mentioned about the digital colonization and sovereignty part. I think we have Mr. Singhvi here from External Affairs Ministry. So maybe, sir, you can add how India is taking up its priorities in forums like G8, G20 and UN to ensure its priorities are met in an international forum.
Let me start with the UN. I think the discussions which have been held in UN primarily revolves around 2 UNGA resolutions which have been passed recently. One was a US-led resolution on the AI for SDGs, making AI available for promoting SDGs all around. And the other one was on AI for capacity building, and which was recently passed on 1st of this month in the UNGA. And we have taken up all our priorities which we think are essential to be mentioned, to get a mention in these resolutions. And just to, I think, inform you that this is the first time we have got mention of the DPI in the UNGA resolution. It has not been there ever mentioned in any of the UNGA resolution, but the resolution which has been passed recently on the 1st in the UNGA, we have mentioned DPI as one of the enabling factor to make available or to harness the benefits of artificial intelligence for development purposes. So I think this is a big achievement for us in terms of going forward as we can further build on that. Secondly, I think we have also been talking about the priorities and principles like safety, reliability, inclusivity, the collaborative AI, all these things get mentioned somewhere, in these declarations which comes out of these conferences which are taking place all around the world. So in G20, you look at the resolution, it finally talked about the pro-innovation regulatory and governance approach. Similarly, GPI, the last summit, had a, I think, emphasis on the collaborative AI. And in the UNGA resolutions on the SDGs, we got included several aspects which we think were important from our perspective, which included the bridging of the science, technology and innovation divide, affordable digital access for all, inclusive design, development and deployment and use of AI, and assisting developing countries in capacity building, and sharing the benefit of safe, secure, and trustworthy AI systems to all. I think these are some of the important aspects which we have advocated all along in our own domestic perspective, and we have been taking forward all these initiatives and the principles even in the global forums, whether it is GPI or G20, or even we have also talked about safety and security. We are a signatory of Bletchley. Similarly, in the Seoul summit, we represented there. We got things like innovation, inclusion. All these things came up in the final declaration. I think they somewhere align with our priorities. So it is in this way, I think perhaps we are also part of the global discourse and discussions, but we cannot be separate from it. We have to take into consideration what are the aspects which are being discussed globally, and we need to incorporate that in our own discourse going forward. So that's something very, very important. But I think the mention of DPI is something that's perhaps I think we can be proud of, that we got included it for the first time in the UNGA resolution. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I think coming back to Mr. Curtis, we are having a GPI meeting happening as of today as itself. So can you, we spoke a lot about the international policy coordination and things we need to do on a larger scale. So what do you think been the role of GPI in especially supporting this kind of international policy coordination? And do you think there are some gaps or opportunities that needed to be addressed?
Okay, Thank you. I think that's an incredibly important question, and I think I'll come back to what our speaker mentioned earlier. At this stage, we're really in the very early days of international frameworks around artificial intelligence, because we're also in the early days of actually using artificial intelligence. And these things, so I would say the governance of artificial intelligence will be critical. Is it finished? No, it's only just starting, and we don't want to necessarily be starting with binding laws when we don't understand what the implications of that, but nor do we want to pretend like there's no need for a law or there's no need for some kind of regulation. So that involves these discussions. So GPAI, I think, is a very important step. I think from a UN perspective, we need to make sure that everybody's on board. We need to make sure that all countries are on board, and whether or not we need to, whether that goes through creating new structures, building on existing structures, these are kind of technocratic, legalistic discussions that have to happen. How much is it related to covenants on human rights, on other issues that are there already? These discussions will happen, but the discussions must happen. That's the point. So GPAI is a wonderful step. It's a first step towards setting up what might be a global governance system that will have to go hand in hand with the real development of artificial intelligence without, as was mentioned by the Secretary, without constraining the fantastic potential that artificial intelligence can offer. And this will require continued discussion amongst countries, amongst players, private sector. Potentially there will be more stricter regulatory frameworks once we know. But I suppose, let's say, just because you have a law that says you need to wear a seatbelt, shouldn't say you shouldn't drive a car, right? So I think we need to understand that. So GPIA, I think, is a good step. We would like to see, from a UN perspective, all member states involved in these discussions. That makes it difficult. It does make it sometimes less than ideal, but at least everybody's at the plate. And then there are other forums where national policies or EU-wide policies and rules and regulations get put in. But all of this conversation is happening. GPIA, I think, is an incredibly important step. It's really the first one going in that direction. And we at UNESCO obviously came in quite early with this recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence, perhaps at the expense of having a legally binding document. I think that's still some way away. But we plan, we're working closely with GPA, watching it. We understand there's just been an expansion to include more members into the GPA framework, which is excellent. And we look forward to aligning it with the broader international framework of agreements. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. I think Mr. Sharma, you have something to add to that.
Yeah, so I just want to put this in perspective that there are 5 concepts that I think India is promoting. And I want to say this is because I think they'll go mainstream globally. Why? Because as Mahavirji mentioned, DPI is now a global concept. The first time, do you know when was DPI used as a word? Was in an Indian press release on G20 on September 13th, 2022. It is less than 2 years ago. Till then, nobody, no government anywhere in the world had used the word DPI. DPG was a term that we used, which we actually withdrew from because we felt that was overly broad and we adopted a word DPI. So I want to acknowledge the effort that has gone in to make DPI a credible term in a UN General Assembly resolution. This is remarkable. I think it calls for a little bit of applause for our foreign service here. Having done that, I think there are 5 concepts that are relevant in AI, which we have to offer to the world. 2 are old, 3 are new. And I'll quickly list down all the 5. And then you have to guess which are the 2 that are old and 3 that are new. Is that fair? Can we do that?
Yes, sir.
Huh? All right. So the first, let me start with trust. What is trust? If an AI system is working, is giving me, let's say, a news summary in the morning, instead of me reading the whole newspaper, it just tells me what is it that I should be taking from Hindustan Times. Is it working for me or is it working for an advertiser? Trust will depend on who is it working for, right? It is like mutual fund. When you take the mutual fund, the person who is recommending a mutual fund is working for you or is it working for the mutual fund? Is it a distributor or is it your agent? So if we have to make AI our own agent, then it becomes important that that curation that happens either on a social media platform or any other platform is clearly demarcated, saying it is an advertiser's agent, not your agent. So please be careful. Or it is your agent and it's making a claim that it is your agent and you know for sure there are rules that make sure that is the case. So which means that we have to unbundle the curation engine from the underlying system that is there. So that experiment, not happening in the government sector, but happening in the private sector with the largest social media platform in India called Glance or from InMobi, is taking place alongside a Western country at the same time. And it's simply called Bring Your Own Curation Engine, BYOCE. That is essential for trust. Otherwise, how can you trust the AI? You don't know it's working for you or working for somebody else. So this is concept number 1. The concept number 2 that comes in governance, which was brought out by the Honorable Secretary here, is what happens with respect to regulation. If, for example, there was a data that was used from country A to train a model in country B, the application was in country C, and I was in country D who was affected by it because I got a deep fake from the application. As you said, who establishes the liability chain across the countries, right? And you can be sure most of the AI will cross country boundaries. So the concept of liability chain is an Indian concept, because the biggest and the most used liability chain in the world is our GST liability chain. Because our GST system and number of transactions is not based on monthly settlements, is not even based on invoices, is actually based on line items of invoices. We are able to trace liability chain at a scale that has not been done anywhere else in the world. But that's been done for tax liability. We have to use it for a different type of liability, which is for AI purpose. So now that's the second concept. The third concept, which has already been mentioned by the Honorable Secretary, is techno-legal. I embarrass many people here. I know whether you will humor me here. How many of you have a license without doing a driving test? Come on, don't be shy. See, some hands are going up. Usually 30% of the hands going up. In India, you can make whatever rule you want. Do you think that rule becomes the reality on the ground? No. So India has had to invent a new way of enforcing the practice on the ground, and that is what our secretary mentioned as techno-legal regulation. So if we have to make any kind of rules that we have talked about, if we have to make sure they land on the ground and they're actually followed, we will have to use techno-legal regulation to make that happen. Right? So I could kind of go on and on. I've covered how many of them so far? Has anybody been keeping track? Huh? All right. So how many of them are new and how many of them are old? Techno-legal is the old one. And there is another old one, which is relatively new, but it is not very well understood, is in the area that Deepak ji is involved in. Account aggregator, which is the predecessor for this, a new approach has been taken, which is also being applied to health, which is saying that if we have to do good governance, we have to get the market to self-regulate. We have to do, of course, the law that has to, and rules the government has to regulate. And the third is that if there is public technology that has to conform to the same type of regulation, techno-legal regulation, they must take the cues from the same normative principles that have been set in place. So the only two places where we have publicly as a country set out those normative principles are one in the account aggregator. Hopefully they will also come in the DPDP rules. I'm looking at you because I'm hoping we'll cascade this into that. And second is in the area of health stack, where there's a published paper which sets down the 10 normative principles for health stack. And so that's the third. Why? Because we are saying if it is the old model, which is that you can, the regulator will ensure nuclear thing is used safely, is not going to work for AI. It's not going to work for many of the new technologies that we are talking about. And the final one that I'll leave with you is that the biggest issue of safety, apart from labeling and testing, is actually to do with distraction. While AI may make a teacher a super teacher, it will also make a student who gets distracted by games or pornography or things like that a fully dud student. And so if we have to secure, we are the country with the largest number of young people in the world. And so if we have to safeguard them from the destructive potential of AI, then we need to create a playground for young people which is different from the playground for grown-up people. And if we have to do that, we have to be able to recognize a young person for age purposes, which is already part of the DPDP Act. Can we do that with technology? And the answer to that is called yes, and that is age tokens. Now the question is, we have the technology to do it in Aadhaar, but today, unfortunately, it appears that out of the 22 countries using MOSIP, 3 of them may be sooner off the block in using age tokens based on our digital identity platform than what we may end up doing in India. So we have huge challenges. We have 5 concepts to offer to the world in this area of governance. We have to make sure we do that. What we've done with DPI is to make them go mainstream. We have to first apply them in India in a sensible fashion. If we do that, I think the world will take the cue and follow that as well. Thank you so much.
So, we have to be very mindful of the time. So, before we close, Professor Ravi, Mr. Goswami, and Mr. Goyal, I think Mr. Sharma has been very elaborate. He brought out many of these issues regarding trustworthy, trust, and other things. And I think one thing that resonated most with the Indian way of doing this. So, sir, what do you think? How can we achieve, some of these safety, trust principles from an Indian way of achieving things?
So before I answer your question, I actually want to call back to something that Urvashi said earlier.
Yes.
So thank you, Urvashi, for joining this panel and saving us from becoming a manel. So I need to say that. But in India, I mean, that's the norm, right? But so let's try to break it. So, I mean, there are a lot of complicated issues that Mr. Sharad brought out, right? So there are no easy answers to these questions, right? So there's like a uniquely Indian way of doing it. Well, we live with it, right? So I mean, like you said, 30% of the people don't have a driving test to get a license. So that somehow we still make that work. So I don't think that's the right thing to do with something as critical as AI, right? And having said that, so if 30% of the people are driving without license, it's fine because they have learned their skills, right? They are not running over people. Well, not because they don't have a license, they're still running over people for other reasons. But the point is, this cannot be something that's universally done. It has to be very, very sector specific, right? So which are the sectors where we are going to enforce, the regulations more clearly, and which are the sectors where we are happy to live with certain amounts of deviations from the regulation is something that we have to evolve, think through, and that's kind of the Indian way of doing things.
Mr. Goswami and Goyal, anything to add to what we discussed? Very briefly, because I'm told to close the session, which I am hesitant to do considering the level of conversation we are having.
I think one thing is true. We should be very careful about following a siren call, right? And maybe I'm going to be a little frank. It's easy to look at the EU as a golden benchmark standard, right? Because they're out there, they do a lot of work, they put in a lot of effort, they do something very comprehensive, but it's for their circumstances. It's not for our social and economic circumstances. And we took and I know this because I sat inside the ministry for 1 long year on the DPDP Act, working with the ministry every day. There was a very conscious policy call not to go that route and not to mimic the EU's GDPR. And it was the right call. That was the right call. And that is the kind of thing that is going to help move things forward competitively for us. And nor should we put up a false binary. I just want to add this. Sometimes we talk about innovation on the one side and protection on the other. This is a false binary because innovation can also be promoted through regulation. UPI and all of that is coming, and on the back of that, we're getting UPI 1, 2, 3 pay and all of this. How is this coming? It's coming through regulatory sandboxes from the regulators. So if regulation is done right, it can be a tremendous driver of innovation. I think we have, again, a lot of things to play for.
Anything to add, Mr. Goyal, over to you from a regulatory point of view.
Just 2 points. We need to have technology, highly advanced technology, but with safe, ethical, and responsible AI. These 2 things may be looking like a contrary things, but we need to take that path only. Just to supplement the societal benefits that we are looking into through the use of either DPI, through the health, through, say, agriculture, means we are just looking at the DG agriculture health stack. So I think this is the way we need to put our foot forward. And just one more point means we have been meeting people who say we are doing regtax. Regtax is basically an advanced type of sandboxing. Means, to those companies who are working, they should do real type of regulatory technology, try to establish high end of an regulatory technology sandboxes. That would basically help the industry as well and the people who are going to be the ultimate beneficiary of those things. Thank you. Thank you, Jibu.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sangvi, you have something to add?
I think we were talking about the inclusive AI and how can we include everyone, in the entire global south in this conversation. But one of the astonishing fact which came to light yesterday, I mean, not yesterday, but it was there, in fact, was not known that a huge number of countries are not part of any discussion on AI. And can you guess the number of countries who are not part of this discussion at all? There are astonishingly 119 countries. And that is something I think we need to look into. And the GPI has made a beginning in this context by having a conversation with Global South. There's a meeting scheduled tomorrow where we will have participation of the Global South. And I think that's something very, very important, a need of ours that we involve everyone in this. Otherwise, it's going to be disastrous for everyone. So I think we need to include everyone in this journey of harnessing the benefits of AI for the global good.
Thank you. And before closing, Urvashi, are you there? I would like to leave the closing remarks to you if you want anything to add to, since you are the original moderator meant for this panel. Anything if you want to add for final words?
No, I think we're well past the clock. So I think I'll just reiterate something that was said earlier. I don't think we should think of regulation and innovation as binary things. I think regulation can drive good innovation. The role of regulation is in fact to create markets for innovation, to create markets for beneficial innovation. I think we have plenty of examples of that already. The advances we've made in innovation around electric vehicles is a very good example. Strong regulation created a market for it and drove adoption. So I think that's what we should be focusing on. What is the positive outcomes that we want from the introduction of AI technologies, and what role can regulation play in creating the markets and creating the incentives for realizing AI in the public interest? Thanks, Chief.
Thank you very much, Urvashi. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Secretary Sir, Sangvi Sir, Mr. Curtis, Ravi, Professor Ravi, Professor Sharma, Professor Mr. Goyal, and Mr. Goswami for a wonderful, very stimulating discussion, and I wish we had more time. So for questions, we can all catch up afterwards, and thank you very much for everyone for joining this.
Thank you. Thank you to our esteemed panelists and audience member. Your thoughts and questions enriched our discussion. Also, special thank you to Dr. Aneja, who was kind enough to join us virtually. I will now request Mrs. Kavita Bhatia, Group Coordinator, AI and Emerging Tech Division and IndiaAI Mission, to kindly join me in warmly felicitating our speakers and panelists. Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Jibu Ilyas. Shri Mahavir Singhvi, Mr. Tim Curtis, Dr. Balaram Ravindran, Mr. Sharat Sharma, Mr. Deepak Goyal, Mr. Arjun Goswami. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll request our panelists to kindly stay back for quick media interaction.